Hello and welcome to BitThink with me, Christina. This is a follow-up video to one I just made about BitMEX, which is a derivatives and futures exchange located in the Seychelles. And in that first video and an article blog post on Steemit, I start to explore a little bit the whole somewhat thorny question of regulation and jurisdictional competition between various places on the globe and their attitude, current and future, towards Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, anti-money laundering laws, know your client laws, along with all of the other kind of regulatory frameworks that human beings have both invented and discarded and then reinvented throughout our commercial history, which is, of course, more than 10,000 years old. So the idea that small countries or new countries or old countries can change the ways in which they're organized so as to appear to other groups to be in competition is a natural phenomenon. There will be always some kind of jurisdictional or rules-based arbitrage played amongst the various tribes of humans all over the world. And with Bitcoin, this is going to prove to be exactly the same. So one of the most provocative ideas about the reality of Bitcoin as the Internet of money, at least to me, is that all of the, or many of the drivers for people's adoption of Bitcoin, which can be expressed as resentment, frustration, and alienation from traditional structures in the expressed form of banks and governments, that the very thing that is expressing that dissatisfaction is also capable of being the mechanism to resolve that dissatisfaction. So increasingly, as I study cryptosphere and as every day cryptosphere continues to develop and evolve, it's clear that the Internet of Money is the censorship-resistant structure necessary to create a mechanism of supra-national, e.g. not nation-state-based, but globally networked voting mechanism for creating a whole new set of rules that address some of the jurisdictional anomalies throughout the world and address some of the clear needs to rethink the legal rules and the scope of the regulatory architecture that we put, all of us collectively who own and use Bitcoin, in place for the creation of the best, most effective, least intrusive, fairest framework for individuals to own and use their own resources. There are developing crypto projects. Clearpool is one of them, and Superman has spoken pretty eloquently on this cryptocurrency project, and it will be one of many, I'm sure. But obviously, if we can transmit and record metrics of value, money, the way we can with Bitcoin, we absolutely can do it with voting. And one of the things that definitely strikes me when I listen to many people talk about anonymity or regulatory control and so on, and the reference immediately to whether it's terrorism or money laundering and so on. The thing that strikes me is that there is this kind of cognitive dissonance around the idea that simply because groups of people may not want to pay into a certain tax system as it is, that those people by definition don't want to pay any tax anywhere ever, or think that taxation for social good is somehow to be avoided at all costs. I think that people should definitely study the Swiss model because there clearly are a set of rules that are simple, easy to follow, fair. Everybody follows them, and it's clear what kind of return on your tax dollar one is getting. So it's not fair, I don't think, to associate a desire for privacy with an indication of guilt, And I also don't think it's fair to assume that anybody on the planet who wishes to escape what are in place regulatory or taxation burdens is by definition saying that they want to escape all of them. It is entirely possible that the Internet of Money gives as many people who want to participate in it the opportunity to create and work out together new and more effective forms of both taxation and a balancing between the rights of privacy and anything that can be argued strongly enough to impinge upon it, which I personally think are very few and far between. Okay, to my mind, one of the most awesome things about Bitcoin and crypto is that it is causing massive waves of self-education to be occurring all over the globe and in all kinds of people. And it means that regular folks whose lives are filled up with all kinds of interesting things to them are being forced to stop and pay attention a little bit to fairly abstract concepts to do with money, to do with laws. It's almost as if the world has been sort of forced into a self-directed philosophy class, which, is really what's underpinning this technological revolution. So while people are having to learn a great deal about tech, they're having to engage in ways that most folks haven't had to for a long time with what are philosophical concepts. And one of the ways in which people are having to really start to think for themselves and discuss amongst themselves are some of the deeper ideas that inform legal theory and certainly play out in the school of thought referred to as libertarianism. So generally, I'm too much of a postmodernist to be a big fan of a kind of fundamentalist position on anything. So those who interpret libertarianism as effectively anarchy, I don't think are doing the school of thought of libertarianism any justice, that's for sure. I'm also not a fan of the frame of mind that is sort of encoded in the nanny state, or the idea that if there is not a rule, then we all must just rush out to make a rule before any of us can do anything. I do think, though, that it's important to just reflect on the fact that undergirding most legal systems, which are just really a way of coding rules for the games that human beings play, commercial, social, cultural, political, that underpinning most systems of law and rule throughout human history have been a kind of set of core ideas about the tension between freedom to do things and freedom from other people doing things. And that we do really, I think, want to reflect, and Bitcoin, Internet of Money, really does guide one to start thinking about the extent to which autonomy is rooted in both one's own ability and freedom to do things, as well as one's freedom from things. And one has to realize that if you're an agent in this system, it means that other autonomous players also have the right to a freedom from you and your set of rights to do things. So, of course, this gets very abstract, very complicated pretty quickly, but it does make one reflect on the fact that, generally speaking, when it comes to making rules for any kind of game, the overall focus should be on making as few as possible and making those as good, effective, simple, specific as possible. And I will shout out Richard Hart again, who I think is one of the least wordy, I'm very wordy, but least wordy and most cogent people out there articulating some of the stuff around both the necessity for rules and the requirement that the rules be aimed to be as good as possible. So if we think generally around the kind of context of rules that we want to see emerge out of the Internet of Money, I think it's worth reflecting on this great word, which Fork Monster, only known as Fork Monster, gave me, which was coup petition. And I think I'm likely to do a whole separate video on this, but it is the idea that the most productive games that human beings can play are the ones that combine competition and cooperation. If you're sitting playing a game of Risk or Monopoly, the people involved in the game are by definition in competition. But it does require a baseline level of cooperation to get everybody to sit around the table and play in the first place. To my mind, when I look at some of the most exciting and, to my mind, viable projects that are emerging in the crypto sphere, and I'm sort of resistant to call them companies because it does bring to mind traditional structures of clients, customers, entities, and shareholders. But when I look at the kinds of crypto projects that are emerging that are most interesting to me, the thing that we see is a kind of capitalism 3.0, where in fact it is the macro context of cooperation, e.g., belonging to distributed networks, choosing to participate as nodes, whether that's actually technically running software or it's being part of social networks. We are seeing entities emerge where the customer is also the shareholder who, and both in the same functionality, are creating the value proposition in the first place. So if we think about how we can use Bitcoin to leverage really important consensus building mechanisms, we can see that there is the scope and there may actually be the requirement for Bitcoin to introduce a framework for what I'm calling supra-national laws. And this will allow for the impulse to create fair systems, the impulse of people who are participating in this as morally innocent people, people who are innocent in their actions, but simply have a desire for a less restrictive, less controlling, freer framework for money and all of the things that money touches, which is everything. So these are just a few of my thoughts on the ways in which different jurisdictions all over the globe are likely to continue to act in variously divergent ways, and how the actual phenomenon of Bitcoin itself as the internet of money and its capacity to be the internet of voting. These are just some of my thoughts about how we need to be careful, all of us, when we start to think about what kind of laws and regulations we want to see and how we feel about various players in the space who are simply engaging in a kind of necessary to their own survival jurisdictional arbitrage. Bermuda is clearly also one of those jurisdictions, tiny, under-resourced jurisdictions, which also has a long history of surviving through a form of arbitrage of jurisdictional flexibility. And so it, of course, frames my perspective on the development of Bitcoin. So thank you for your time and your attention. And if you've enjoyed this, definitely hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you on the other side.